All right, people are still joining us, but we have a lot to cover, so I think we'll get started. Welcome, everybody, to Big Tent USA. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Melissa Kane, and I'm delighted to host today's discussion on the very, very timely topic of expanding voting access with Connecticut Secretary of the State Stephanie Thomas and Barbara Smith Warner, who is the Executive Director of the National Vote at Home Institute. As I'm sure you've noticed, there's an incredible amount of news headlines and misinformation about absentee and early voting swirling around the country right now, as many states have already begun early voting. But what really it comes down to is that it's about inclusion, and it's about ensuring a way for every eligible voter to be able to vote. At Big Tent USA, we're putting democracy over partisanship. And there are 18 days until the election. So I'm asking you to please join us in doing something to protect our democracy. We have phone banking, letter writing, ballot curing, which we'll talk about later, and voter protection opportunities on our website. So please click on the link that's in the chat, or will be in the chat, to do something. And please share this information with your friends and family. Okay, now I am thrilled to introduce you to our guests. Barbara Smith Warner serves as the Executive Director of the National Vote at Home Institute, a nonprofit that works to promote and expand the use of mailed out ballots that allow all voters to safely and securely vote at home. Voting at home is foundational democracy that centers every voter in their right to vote and dramatically increases both turnout and participation. Barbara served for 9 years from 2014 to 2022 as an Oregon state representative, including almost 3 years as the majority leader of the Oregon House. She is a lifetime democracy defender who has worked as a legislative educator and political organizer and is deeply committed to an open, accessible government that is of, for, and by the people. Welcome, Barbara. Stephanie Thomas, our own Stephanie Thomas, was sworn in as Connecticut's Secretary of the State on January 4th, 2023. With a distinguished 30-year career advising and problem solving for nonprofit organizations, running her own businesses, and serving as a state representative of Connecticut's 143rd district, that's Norwalk, Wilton, and Westport, Secretary Thomas brings a unique blend of business expertise and a passion for civics to public service. Since taking office, Secretary Thomas has led the implementation of significant election reforms in the state, including the rollout of early voting and a new centralized voter registration system. In September 2023, she secured a historic investment of $25 million to replace the state's aging tabulators, marking Connecticut's first voting machine upgrade since 2006. During her term, Secretary Thomas will also institute the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act of Connecticut and automatic voter registration at several Connecticut agencies. We're going to start today with Secretary Thomas, who's going to be talking to us about the landscape of voting in Connecticut, and the ballot initiative that Connecticut is going to be voting on November 5th regarding absentee voting for all. Welcome to Big Tent, Stephanie. It's good to see you.
Thank you, Melissa. So happy to be here. I see many familiar names out in the audience. I'm going to share my screen, and while I do that, there's a lot happening in elections, as you alluded to, not only in Connecticut, but all around the country. I know every day when I see the news, there's an election story. And you said something in your introductory remarks about like our democracy. And I just always remind people, this is our democracy. And in a way, I'm glad that elections have risen to such public notice, because many people weren't paying attention to how they were funded, what state legislators were doing to restrict access. So now that the spotlight is shining, we have a real opportunity to create the democracy that we want to see. So I'm going to start with a little bit of information about the absentee ballot voting in Connecticut. Most people who don't live in Connecticut are surprised to learn how restrictive our law is, because we are the outlier. Our ballot question is about universal access to absentee ballots. Here, we were calling it no excuse. It goes by many names, but essentially it means that you can request an absentee ballot simply because you want to. You don't need to have a reason. And that is what is happening in 37 states, or I should say 36 states in the District of Columbia. So Connecticut is really an outlier. We currently require one of 6 very specific reasons to request an absentee ballot, and they're listed here. But as you might expect, they include things like absence from town, or sickness, or physical disability, or even if your religion prevents you from partaking in secular activities. And this year, finally, after almost 2 decades of work by many people, we have a ballot question this year that reads, shall the Constitution of the state be amended to permit the General Assembly to allow each voter to vote by absentee ballot? And I always joke that ballot question, explanatory text are always written by lawyers, which means that 1 in 10 people can understand what it means. It is factually accurate, but I spend a lot of my time going around explaining what this ballot question does and doesn't mean. And I've heard a lot of the same questions come up, so I'm going to run through some of them quickly. Uh, Most people say, hey, a constitution is sacrosanct. We can't change it. Like, that sounds really, really serious. But it's not as serious as it sounds. Connecticut has the oldest constitution in the country, hence why we're the Constitution state. But a lot of the old states who did their constitutions very early wrote their election law in the state constitution. So unlike many states where the legislature can just go in and make a change, we cannot do that here in Connecticut. And we have a long history of making constitutional amendments on several election issues, but many of them have been based on absentee voting. I won't get into all of the amendments, but the first time a constitutional amendment was made in Connecticut related to absentee ballots was to ensure that Civil War soldiers could vote when they were off fighting. And you see back in 1964, it was because there were some conflicts with Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and the amendment was made that I just mentioned about if your religion prohibits secular activities on the day of an election, and those were primary elections, you can vote by absentee ballot. So it's not as unusual as it might sound when you hear the term constitutional amendment. The other thing I hear a lot is like, I don't like the way fill in the blank does it. I don't like the way Connecticut does it, or I'm from some other state. I don't like the way they do it. So it's really important to know that literally every state has a different system, and they have a system that works for them. I often, I've done research on all the states that offer universal access. And one of the things I found in my research was that Alaska accepts a ballot via fax machine. And at first I thought, like, what? Like, why would that be the case? That's crazy. We would never do that in Connecticut. But then I realized November in Alaska looks a lot different than November in Connecticut. And I share that point to underscore that states come up with something that works for them. And I also remind people that the ballot question just allows the legislature to create a law. And the good news is we, the people, can be involved in the lawmaking process. Many of us often opt out of that opportunity, But we have several opportunities highlighted here or bolded here throughout the lawmaking process to make our voice heard. When a bill is proposed, we can speak to those legislators. If a committee chooses to raise a bill, there will be a public hearing where people can go in person or on Zoom or send an email or even join by telephone to make their voice heard. After a public hearing, there's always changes. So there's an opportunity to talk to legislators at that time to get changes incorporated. And it's not until the final version is presented and voted upon in the House and the Senate that a bill is finalized. So when I was in the legislature, I was always surprised how few people took time to get involved in the process. But it's a great opportunity to make sure policies are being adopted that reflect what you hope to see when you vote on a ballot question. And you alluded, Melissa, earlier on to all the misinformation that is swirling around. And I'll take a moment just to define disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation. Disinformation is false information put out purposefully with the intent to deceive. Malinformation is false information, or I should say true information put out but out of context with the hope of shaping a certain perception. But misinformation is what I like to say we all do when we repeat things, we hit like, we share things that we have not independently verified. So when here in Connecticut, there's been a lot of talk recently about absentee ballots and our laws and procedures. But states that have universal access have a very different system than we have in Connecticut. Our system was set up for low frequency absentee ballot voting. It was never a very popular thing in Connecticut until the pandemic when people were afraid to go out and vote in person. But the states who have had universal access, many of them since the 1980s, those systems provide greater ballot security and also greater voter protections. So if the ballot question passes and we have to consider a law here in Connecticut, there are a few different types of things that we'll be thinking about. One is how the application process works. Many states, like the orange ones, just require basic information, and that's our current system. But many states, like those in yellow, require some sort of additional information like a driver's license number or last four of your social. And those states in gray require some other type of identification. It might be a student ID or a passport or a military ID, tribal ID, etc. We'll also have to think about ballot tracking. Before this call started, Julie was mentioning how she received her absentee ballot and she was able to look on her phone to get that notification. Most states with universal access have very sophisticated statewide ballot tracking. So I liken it to like how we in Connecticut might track our UPS package and know where it is every step of the way. So there is a lot of security there, and there's a lot of reassurance from voters that they know what's happening, when it's happening. And it's a great safeguard because you see where your ballot is or your application is in the process. Right now in Connecticut, if someone didn't receive their ballot, if they don't think to call and follow up, they just have no idea like what's happening. We also have an opportunity to think about who can distribute absentee ballot applications. that is something that has received a lot of attention here in Connecticut, and it's something I think about a lot. Connecticut is very unique. There are only three states, I believe, who administer elections at the municipal level, and Connecticut is one of them. All of these old New England states started doing things one way, and we're like the land of steady habits, so we haven't changed. But most states administer their elections at the county level, and that creates some real differences. But who can distribute an absentee ballot application varies greatly. Here in Connecticut, we have no restrictions, but many states do allow third-party groups to distribute. So that could be a political candidate, or it could be the League of Women Voters. It could be anyone, but there are deadlines around when they're allowed to do it, what kind of turnaround time is required. And then there are some states who handle it purely at the state or county level, and no one else is allowed to distribute applications. And then lastly, from a voter protection standpoint, ballot curing, I think, is extraordinarily important. Here in Connecticut, our current absentee ballot law means we cannot open our ballots until election day. And I have seen it where someone forgot to sign the envelope. Or this was a big thing during the pandemic. A couple thought they were saving money, and they would put two ballots in the same envelope, but that's not allowed. So those votes in our current system basically are just thrown out because we can't open them until election day. So there's no opportunity to notify the voter or for them to come in and make and cast a valid ballot. But most states with universal access have a cure period. And that can range from 1 week, I believe the longest is 3 weeks, so that once they process the ballot, usually there's some sort of envelope situation where they're verifying if that is done correctly. If it's done incorrectly, you have up to 3 weeks to come in and make a change. And I see that as a real voter protection benefit because no one wants their vote to be thrown out. And on the map here, you'll see the yellow states are the ones that allow ballot curing. The light gray still allow it, but it's not statewide. So certain counties allow it and certain counties don't. And then lastly, before I wrap up, people are always asking me, so what does a yes or a no vote mean? So a yes vote means that the General Assembly may consider a law to adopt universal access to absentee ballots. As I said, it would go through the usual lawmaking process. There's no requirement around when that bill would need to be raised. There's no requirement about what would need to go into that bill. And a no vote, quite simply, means keeping the existing law requiring one of the same excuses. So before I turn it back to Melissa, people often ask me, like, what can I do? So with regard to the ballot measure here in Connecticut, definitely keep educating other voters. Most people don't know that there is a ballot question. I did a town hall with AARP and they did a spot poll, and only 27% of attendees knew there was a ballot question this year. Obviously, volunteer to help get out the vote, let people know if they care about this issue, that this is one of the many things they can vote on the ballot this year, and help stop the spread of misinformation. Just letting people know that absentee ballot programs are not one size fit all. Like, you can create anything you want that makes sense for the sensibilities of our state. And I invite everyone, take out your phones right now and follow us on we're on every social media channel, Instagram, Facebook, X, TikTok, LinkedIn. because we often put out we put out materials every single day. And as we move into this election season, it's a great time for you to check our sites and share that information to help get trusted information out. We're trying to make sure people know that we are the trusted source for any election information, not only because of disinformation, but misinformation. Well-meaning people put out content all the time. I've seen it. Typos with the polling hours are, little things that are wrong. So we encourage everyone to follow us and use our materials. And then everyone else, three things I talk about a lot, so I'm not going to leave an audience without saying it. Learn how elections are funded in your state. Most people don't realize how underfunded elections are at the local, state, and federal level. Most people don't realize that federal funding for everyone was cut by 20 million in the latest budget. So all of these things have an impact on voter access, voter protection, election integrity. So it's really important. And once you know, if you think it should change, lobby for that change. And most importantly, get involved in the legislative process. When I'm following the news, I'm seeing the trend of more and more being restricted in various states. And much like here in Connecticut, bills come up all the time, but we have to fight to stop them. And without people involved in that process, they don't get stopped. So if anyone needs some hints about how to get more involved, powerofcivics.ct.gov is about Connecticut government, but it also is about local and federal, and most of the lessons there can be applicable anywhere in the United States. So with that, I will throw it back to you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you so much. First of all, I want to say that I follow CTSOTS on Instagram, and it's where everything's happening.
That's
It really is a source for great information. Thank you. So much information. I think what sticks out to me is what you said in the beginning. We have an opportunity to create the democracy we want. And I want to hand it over to Barbara, because I really think that that's what her focus is on. So thank you. And Stephanie, thanks so much.
Thank you. Sorry, I got rid of myself.
Pleasure. Well, thank you again, Secretary Thomas, and thank you, BigTent, and everyone who has joined us today. I'm Barbara Smith-Warner. I'm the Executive Director of the National Vote at Home Institute, and I will share my screen so you can look at both me and the slides. And let's see, and then I have to hit slideshow. Look at that, it's magic. So good morning, everyone. And yes, that is a great point. I just want to highlight, Secretary Thomas mentioned how not one size fits all, right? And that we have 50 states in the District of Columbia and a couple other places that run elections in this country, and they all do run their own election. We don't have one election, we have 51 or more. And we at the National Vote at Home Institute are great believers and advocates for voting at home, which is what allowing no excuse, universal absentee ballots for any reason. I'm trying to remember the language that she used. It was so good. But I want to go a little beyond just what's going on in Connecticut to kind of give you a sense of who we are and what we are advocating for, as well as kind of the status of voting at home all across the country. So just briefly, organizationally, what we do what we say we do. We work to increase voters' access to, use of, and confidence in voting at home. Now, a full universal vote at home system is where every active registered voter is automatically delivered a ballot by the U.S. mail a couple weeks before the election. I am another person on this call who is anxiously awaiting my ballot because I live in Oregon, one of the 8 states in D.C. that do have universal voting at home. So I expect my ballot any day now. That ballot can be returned by postage paid mail or in person to drop boxes to election offices. There are multiple security measures, which I will talk about in a little bit, but ranging from there's a barcode that's tied to every voter in every ballot. There's signature verification, and ballot tracking and curing. So, and we believe very much that voting at home, it's not just another way to vote. It is transformative democracy reform because really it centers the voter in the process. You know, for years when we think and we talk about voting, we have by default thought about how you as the voter have to go out and find and get your ballot, right? Whether it's early, whether it's absentee, whether it's on election day, you as the voter have to go out and find it. What voting at home does is it flips the script on that and it centers the voter. It says, if democracy is if voting is the most important thing you do in a democracy, it should be as easy as possible. And the way you center the voter is you send them their ballot, period. It also has the happy coincidence of maximizing both voter engagement and turnout. When you have your ballot at home, you can really thoroughly research, you can vote all the way down, and turnout has been significantly impacted. After the 2020 election, there's some interesting research by a public policy center out of USC that said that in the states that mailed everyone a ballot in 2020, turnout went up by 5.6% compared to states that did not, which is a really significant number. So where are we at across the country with voting at home? Well, as Secretary Thomas said, everybody, runs elections their own way, and everyone can vote at home in every state in the country. The question is how kind of easy or hard that we make it. So this is how we broadly think about the 4 categories of voting at home. And again, the purple states you see here are the full vote at home states, the universal vote at home states, where indeed every registered voter automatically receives a ballot before election day. Then on the other end of the spectrum, where Connecticut, you can see we have a little asterisk there, is the currently 14 excuse required states, where you need a specific excuse in order to get that ballot. In between are the blue and green categories. The green states are the states where no need for an excuse. You can just get a ballot for any reason, but you have to ask repeatedly. In some states, it's every election. In some states, it's you do one per year or per 2 year. But then the blue states are what we call single sign up. You just sign up one time and you automatically receive your ballot going forward until you opt out or whatever it is. So this is kind of the range of ways. And what we do is we work to increase voters' access to those mail ballots, to voting at home. And we also take every state where it's at, right? We're very supportive of Connecticut moving from excuse required to no excuse. We have worked with a number of states to go from no excuse to single sign up. Michigan and Minnesota are 2 states that have just made that transition recently. And then we work with those states to go to hopefully move closer to universal vote at home. So just a brief myths versus facts about voting at home. Thank you for pointing out that timeline, Secretary Thomas, because indeed, mail ballots, voting at home started back in the Civil War. It has been around for centuries. And here in Oregon, we have been a full vote at home state since 2000. So 24 years, we have been sending everybody a ballot. And it has kind of gradually moved. It's different reasons in every state, right? It is mostly in the West, but Vermont also now does this for their general elections. There is a range of people say, oh, it's all blue states. Tell Utah that. So there really is a range. But the most important myths versus facts are, first of all, the partisan bias, this idea that it only helps one side or another. And the truth is, there are multiple academic studies that show it increases turnout overall, period. Now, caveat is when one side is saying use mail ballots and the other side is not, it may look like there's a partisan ballot advantage. And the truth is that overall, when you send everybody a ballot, turnout goes up for everyone. The other thing that you probably hear the most about, not only in mail balloting, but in lots of other elements as well, unfortunately, is fraud allegations. Those are simply not true. I mentioned briefly before some of the security elements in mail ballots. The most important one, I think, that people don't realize with allegations of ballot box stuffing, every ballot is connected to an individual voter. you can't make photocopies of it and send a bunch in, because first of all, only the first one will count. It just doesn't work that way. Also, signature verification is something that happens in many states to make sure that the person who is registered is the person that filled it in. And a robust curing process that the secretary also mentioned, really important. I like to highlight Colorado. Colorado has a brilliant curing system where if your ballot comes in and there's any incident, whether it's a signature mismatch or it wasn't dated or whatever it is, they have a thing called text to cure, where they will text you and say, hey, there's a problem with your ballot. And you text back a picture of yourself and a picture of your license or your ID, and your ballot is cured. And you certify, yep, that's my ballot. Whatever the mismatch was, yes, that's my ballot. So there's a whole range of ways that states and municipalities do that. But there are many security factors that make voting at home extremely secure. And then, of course, the old, it's too complicated, right? Well, I would argue, as somebody who's been doing it for a while, that the ability to sit down with your ballot and research and talk to your family and talk to people and have that all there versus having to go in and make all those decisions in a ballot box, it actually is a great way to be a more informed voter. It's also quite efficient and less expensive. When Colorado did their transition to universal vote at home in 2014, now when Oregon did it, it was so long ago that nobody was really paying attention. But in 2014, they studied the cost impact, and the costs of running their elections went down by 40% by moving to universal vote at home. So I just wanted, and feel free to ask me any questions about specific things, but broadly, there's so many mistruths. So the idea of, the truth is that overall, we have a very safe, secure voting system in this country, period. And voting at home is a part of that, and voting in person is part of that, and voting early is part of that. We have a safe and secure system, and anything you hear designed to sow distrust or fear is to keep you from voting, because ultimately, that is what makes a strong democracy, is to have as many people voting as possible, and to stay, and it's important for all of us to stay focused on that and to not let the distractions take us away from that. So a couple resources for everybody here. We have a great, we call it our How Americans Vote at Home tool. It's on our website. I'll have a link to that on the last slide here. But this is all 50 states and DC, kind of a whole range of things about how do you vote at home in each of these states. If it's an excuse, what are the excuses? How can I return it? How can I apply for the mail ballot? Can I do it online? What are the third-party rules that Secretary Thomas mentioned? What about the curing? What are the deadlines for receiving it? And is it a postmarked by or a received by state? So our How Americans Vote at Home tool, I know that there are people on this call, not just from Connecticut, but from other states. And if you, it's really a great resource to know specifically about what you can and can't do in your state. So I hope that the folks watching this will go to that site and look at that. So to close out, always a call of action, particularly when you're at BigTent, because that's what they do. First of all, on constitutional question 1, I've got a link up here to the Connecticut Action, who has been doing a lot of the grassroots advocacy on behalf of this. And this is a site where you can go and pledge to vote and get yard signs and do whatever else. But that is the website to go to in support of that for Connecticut. And then here is the link second to our How Americans Vote at Home tool that you can go to and find out about your state, share with other people. And then finally, please just go to our website broadly to sign up for our email newsletter. You can contact me because what we will be doing next year and going forward is we will engage in states. We have a whole community of election administrators who work with mailed out ballot systems. We have resources, best practices, what's being done and how in other states. So what we'll be doing going forward is engaging in those states and helping to support. We'll provide resources for Connecticut if the constitutional question passes and they want resources for what are some of the best practices about how other states do it. We'll be working in states that are no excuse, but that are interested in moving to single sign up. We're hoping to work in Pennsylvania to establish a statewide curing standard rather than having it be county by county. But that's the kind of work also we'd love for you to be engaged with as we continue to do to try to really move us toward this transformative democracy reform that really will center voters and help to maximize voter engagement in our very precious democracy. Thank you.
Wow, Barbara, thank you.
I guess I have to stop sharing.
What an incredible presentation. Thank you. Thank you both. Two amazing presentations. We feel very lucky to have you here today. There are lots of questions from everybody on the Zoom, lots in the chat. I have a lot of questions too. I think I want to start honing in a little more. There's a lot of confusion about vote curing. One question that I think is coming up and that I want to understand is in Connecticut, Stephanie, what are we doing to change it so that we can maybe open absentee votes or early votes earlier so that we could allow for curing? And would this constitutional amendment in any way affect that?
I'll start with the last question first. The constitutional amendment, if adopted, would necessitate that we create a very different absentee ballot process than the one we currently have because of the scale. So ballot curing, as I said, is generally seen as a best practice. The period of time changes. And it's because there are more security features built in, like Barbara talked about signature verification. Many states have signature verification. We know that people's signatures change over time, and despite great equipment, etc., it might not look like a match. So if you have signature verification, you have to have robust ballot curing, because if it doesn't match, you have to give those voters enough time to come in and vote some other way. So if the ballot question passes, I believe we would have ballot curing. In terms of our current system, during the pandemic 2020, Governor Lamont wrote an executive order that allowed the ballots to be opened 2 days in advance of the election, not the ballots, the outer envelope. That was done as a time-saving measure because our total absentee ballot count went from something like 5,000 statewide to like 700,000. So we would have never gotten results election night if we hadn't been allowed to open those outer envelopes. But that executive order died with the end of the emergency, and I've not heard any talk to introduce ballot curing for any other reason.
Interesting. So it sounds like voting yes will actually get us closer to being able to ballot cure in Connecticut.
Absolutely.
Barbara, I would ask you, and you started talking about this, which states are the states where we could volunteer virtually to help with curing ballots?
While I am not specifically sure where you can help doing it, one of the things on the tool is it talks, we do indeed have a column on the How America Votes at Home tool about pre-processing and when it happens. And first I would say one of the things to lift up something that Secretary Thomas said, that ability to cure really goes a long way towards establishing confidence, right? That's one of the things we want. We want people to have confidence in the system, and curing is a huge part of that, and ballot tracking is a huge part of that. But pre-processing in particular, it's fascinating because I was just looking through this column on our tool the other day. It ranges from many states, they can start pre-processing the minute the ballot comes in, right? They get it, they check the signature, they do the curing, and there are ones like Pennsylvania where they've been fighting over this for the last 4 years, where they can't start pre-processing until the morning of election day. And it really does impact voters' confidence because the ability to do that beforehand. Here in Oregon, they cure as they come in, and they've got a stack of ballots that they figuratively, so they can push the counting thing at 8 o'clock on election day, and those are all in and ready to be counted. So the process itself, though, it really varies. I will tell you, I just got an email today with a link to a list in Philadelphia where you can click on that and see all the people whose ballots have come in with a problem on them. So that's a way, if you want to do that and see if you know anybody, and encourage them to do that. But more generally, yes, I'll try to find out, and we'll check with you guys.
I know on BigTent's website in our Do Something area, there are links to, I believe, states where ballot curing can happen. I'm just sort of interested to know sort of how many states. But it leads me to the next question, which is really, as you talk about ballot curing increasing security and increasing people's confidence, I think some of the misinformation that's out there and disinformation is that it actually does the opposite. It allows for more fraud, right? So I guess my question to both of you is, are there ways to combat all of the disinformation and misinformation to help voters feel empowered instead of disenfranchised? I know that's a huge question, but answer chunks of it, because I know we have lots of other questions, but that was mine.
I have two things that I want to talk about that we haven't touched upon, but it is the world we're operating in. And it sounds highfalutin, but we know there is foreign malign influence meant to undermine our political, economic, social stability in America. We know, I encourage people to look at information during election season that is unclassified or declassified every week. So last week's report, like, we know Russia, China, Iran, now Cuba, are trying to impact the outcome of the presidential election or the congressional elections, or just trying to sow general chaos. A lot of this information is often classified, so like we the people won't know it until long after the fact, but we know this is happening. We know the tactics have gotten smarter. And remember the definition I gave. They just have to put out a little disinformation, and they rely on us to share it as misinformation because we think it's correct. And they have gotten better about, like, they may say Melissa Kane is someone who has 1 million social media followers, and we know she's on social every day. We will flood her in different avenues with misinformation, disinformation, and you just put it out because you're seeing it from multiple places. But
you believe it, right?
Exactly.
I guess if it's said enough, it becomes true.
Exactly.
Right.
So between that and the lack of civic literacy and understanding how elections work, when people start asking me questions, I'm like, I invite you to go on the website, you can Google it, and read the Registrar of Voters Manual. It's about 189 pages. I don't recommend it to stay awake, but there are so many systems in place, so many checks and balances, so many steps that have to be followed that people forget. The reason we think and know election fraud exists is because it's caught. And usually as a result of all of these many systems and checks and balances. So I try to push back hard on these narratives because they're just not based in truth.
Yeah, amen. I would just add a couple things. First of all, we have a decentralized election system, right? The ability to commit enough fraud in order to significantly impact, races when you would have to do it in the zillion places where elections are. That's just the kind of ground, the bottom ground of how difficult to impossible it would be. Number two, indeed, stuff gets caught. That's why we know about things that people have done, whether it's somebody, there were a number of people in this year's primary who tried to test the mail ballot system by mailing in a ballot and then voting in person, and they were caught. And some of them were charged with felonies because that is what that is, right? It is a high risk for a very, low reward, the inability to really make significant changes. But then the other thing I would say is that acknowledging the impact of social media and all that swirl of dis and misinformation. And, I can't not quote Mark Twain about the truth not getting on its pants before a lie has gone halfway around the world. And it's a longer term thing, but the idea of bringing people into the system, if you can get even election deniers to come and volunteer, to come and do a walkthrough of an election office, to be a poll place worker, as odd as that sounds. We were at a democracy conference last year. My communications director, Tyra Wilkes, had this long conversation with someone who they had kind of completely changed their outlook because they were all fired up, and they went and they toured their election office and they were really intrigued, and then they volunteered as a poll worker, and it completely flipped their understanding. Knowledge is power, education is how we do it, and we just have to, you can't let anything go unanswered, and you just have to keep repeating the truth as many times as possible.
Yeah. It's interesting. I'm looking at a question from my friend Jonathan Perlow in the chat. And it's let's talk about the elephant in the room, right? Republicans oppose broader voter participation and challenge election integrity because they believe it will gain them a partisan advantage, which is new, which is actually new. We were talking earlier before the Zoom started about the voting laws in Florida being much broader than even in a place like Connecticut, because it was a place where Republicans realized that it was better if everybody voted. So the question Jonathan has is, what's being done by trusted nonpartisan voices rather than Democrats to counter that disinformation, right? The disinformation that's coming out from, it seems like, Republicans challenging the importance of broader access to voting.
I mean, we're a nonpartisan organization. We've had Republicans on our board. Here in Oregon, voting at home was a Republican idea before everyone else. Like, that was who passed it and promoted it in the 90s. Many of the states, if you look at the history of increasing expansion to mail ballots, it was Republican legislatures all through the 90s and the early 2000s who moved that shift from excuse required to no excuse and to single sign up. Arizona and Montana, over 80% of their voters are single sign up permanent absentee voters. You wouldn't think that, right? But the truth is, that's all we can keep doing is try to continue to have that conversation and to be honest and truthful about it, and to engage and bring in any organization we can who can and will support that.
Stephanie, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just add, I usually push back on broad-based characterizations. So I won't say Republicans, but perhaps the national party right now is leaning in that direction. Our office is also nonpartisan, but I will say that raising the question of trusted, like who's trusted, that is the problem. The people who are trusted voices, and I have these conversations with other secretaries in so-called red states all the time, and many of them have said, like, hey, my constituents, my voters were concerned, so fill in the blank. We've opened up our election offices, we've done tours, we have literally, like, they went to all those people who sent them the horrible emails, like tried and true MAGA, invited them in, showed them the whole process. And they still say the number one problem they have as secretary is that no one trusts their elections. They also changed all their laws to make them, as tight as possible, but it's still a problem. I do think what Barbara said last is something we all have to remember. We just have to keep repeating the truth. There are some people who won't believe the truth even when we repeat it, and I'm not sure what we do about that. I think the party has to solve that problem, but we will not convince them with the truth. My goal as secretary is to make sure we don't overcorrect for a small segment of the population. So I am not pursuing legislation that solves imaginary problems, but legislation that solves real problems. And I'll just very quickly, I thought what Jonathan was going to say, the elephant in the room in Connecticut, we've had some court cases recently about absentee ballot fraud in Connecticut. And people have been arrested and there are court cases pending, etc. But I just underscore that the players who have been implicated have been alleged to have participated in these types of fraud, this type of fraud for many, many, many years. And they have been caught in the past. So what's missing is swift adjudication of these cases. The laws themselves, we made some adjustments last session to close some loopholes. And it's one of the reasons that I support universal access personally, because I think it would allow us to add many security features that we don't currently have.
Switching directions a little bit. I've got a question, and I'm not sure, I want to make sure I get it right, but I think the question from Kathy Wagner has to do with asking if curing before election day, including the security slip cover, isn't that better, and is it possible in some states? I believe it is possible.
Yes. Yes, the states, I would say all the states that do curing, or most of them, start at worst on election day. But ideally they start sooner than that. That gives you the, again, it's just the idea that when it comes in, there's a whole process they do. First thing, you check the signature, check the date, whatever the other things are. In Pennsylvania, they finally figured out this. In Oregon, we used to have a secrecy sleeve, like you'd put your ballot in it and then your outside office. And we honestly got rid of it because our clerks were like, this does nothing to add to security. And all it does is give us a whole nother bunch of people that we have to get to come cure their ballots for no reason. But in Pennsylvania, for example, they have a hole in the outside of their ballot, and the inside ballot, the inside security envelope is a color. This is a recent change they just made to make up, and so that they look, and if they don't see the color, then it's missing the envelope, and then you can pass that along. So there's a lot of things like that you can do. So yes, the short answer is yes. It is much better to cure beforehand, because again, that whole, there is that kind of that thing about people want instant gratification, right? Oh, I want to know who won on election night. In Oregon, we're just used to it. You often don't know until the end of the week, right? Because
it also feels like the longer it takes, people start to feel like it's illegitimate.
Correct.
And can I just say, there is no state in the country that has certified election results on election night. There is no law in any state in the country that requires final counts and verifications to be done on election night.
That's
So
right.
we just have this idea because we see it on the news that it's final, but it's not. Even here in Connecticut, local election officials don't have to certify their results for 48 hours. And that's to allow them to do cross checks, checks and balances, etc. Because here in Connecticut in particular, a lot of our elections are decided, especially local, with a small margin. So, they're double checking their work. So when they certify those final numbers 48 hours later, that is really the only election result you should believe.
Okay, I'm looking at the time. I think we have time for one more quick question. We've got, how does keeping up with address changes work in a vote by mail state?
Yeah, it's primarily done through the National Change of Address system with the Postal Service. And it varies state by state. In some states, if you they send regular mailings out to their list to kind of keep it clean, see who comes back with an address change on it, and all the standard ways that I think whether they're mail ballot states or not, that they do it. You check records against the Social Security Administration, against the Department of Motor Vehicles, against the kind of all the state and local agencies that manage that kind of stuff. But the National Change of Address is the biggest thing. And people, people generally want to be able to vote. So here in Oregon, we still have a voter registration deadline of 3 weeks out. So it was 2 days ago was our voter registration deadline, but that's only for people who aren't registered. If you were registered and you've moved and your ballot comes back, so you've moved and you realize, oh, when the ballots go out, you didn't get it, you can still go and say, here's who I am, show proof of where you live. And they're like, oh yes, we still have you registered at your old address, but you can still get a ballot and vote there. But yeah, it's a variety of ways. And it's something that is, kind of developed and refined all the time in those states, because that is the most important thing they can do, is to keep their voter rolls up to date.
And that begs the question, which I can't leave out, what about dead people voting?
Yeah. Same thing. Social Security Administration, all of the death certificates from the counties and the state, all of those things. It's all clean. I have to mention, because of the big Jimmy Carter news, every state has different rules about whether your ballot counts. If you vote before Election Day and then you die before Election Day, does your vote still count? And every state has different rules about that. I'm assuming that I'm pretty sure that Georgia, as long as you got your vote in on time, or as long as you got your vote in before you passed away, it still counts. But there are places where if you vote early and then you die, they will pull it out, and they find out, they will pull it out.
And they're looking, and it sounds like,
That's
there are
exactly
safeguards.
right. That's exactly right.
And
Elections administrators are very dedicated to their jobs. I have spent the last 2 years going to their state meetings, their national meetings, and engaging. These are folks who, the most heart-wrenching things someone said at this last conference that I was at is, I wish that I could go back to the time when my job was boring and nobody knew what I did. Because these are folks who have toiled in the ballot is so important, getting making sure our elections run well and run successfully and run smoothly. That these people are professionals who are dedicated to their job, who don't do it to support one side or another or any side. They do the hard work. There's redundancies throughout the system. And they they take this very seriously.
And we're thankful to them, and they get death threats. And I know here in Connecticut last year, we worked hard, and our General Assembly had to pass legislation to further protect election workers. We've got 2 minutes left. What can we do in the next few weeks to help ensure wide access to voting? I'm going to point people again to the Do Something section of the BigTent website, which has so many things, including signing up for ballot curing. Barbara, any thoughts? Stephanie, any thoughts on good places to go to help ensure widespread access to voting?
Yeah. Just remember, just go outside of the people you normally talk to, but start with that, right? Is everybody in your family voting? Do they have a voting plan? Are your neighbors voting? Do they have a voting plan? The people that you work with, engage, because it'll make you feel better. If you're anxious, there's nothing better than doing something to make you feel better. Go in and, who are you the most concerned about? Go and volunteer for them. But mostly it really does start at home with your circle. In a time when there's so much distrust and misinformation, the most meaningful thing you can do is talk to people who know you and with whom you are credible, to make sure they understand the system works, your vote is important. All of this noise ultimately is to keep you from voting, period. And so make sure that you do everything you can, that everybody you know is ready to engage.
And I'll just piggyback and say the most important thing is to do something. People want to do the right thing or find that big thing. We are the ones we're looking for. We are the ones to save ourselves. Everything we do that is different than what we did yesterday helps the situation. Talk to everybody. And I would just end that notion with governance is different than politics. We are in a political season now, but people will be elected to govern us. It is very American to talk about governance. I don't care if you don't want to talk about politics, but how we participate in this representative democracy is why I think we all choose to stay in this country. So talking to your neighbors, figuring out how to make your voice heard, that's what it's all about. So
thank you. You said it so beautifully, Secretary Thomas. Thank you, Secretary Thomas. Thank you, Barbara. What a fascinating discussion. Everybody, thank you for being here. Listen to what these two really experts in this field are saying. Talk to everyone you know. Help ensure that everybody gets to vote and that they believe in the sanctity and the security of their vote. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to share a recording, and we have a couple of great events coming up, so please sign up for those. Again, thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.